we're talking about a kind of communication and a kind of perception of reality which is interpenetrated. It's not the kind of distanced subject object type relationship with which we tend to see the world and each other.
Sometimes I feel as if our thinking, our habitual thinking, hijacks those acts of creation and wants to own them by saying what it means.
Putting it on paper, writing about the apology, even though it's probably being written with tears in his eyes, and knowing that it's a kind of prayer or thanksgiving to somebody who inspired him, but also to somebody he knows is immortal and is not dead, but living for sure now within the pages of the apology.
Welcome back to another episode of The Ladder, Journeys in Platonic Mysticism. In this episode, our hosts contend with one of the more ticklish tensions in Platonism. On the one hand, he is understood to be the progenitor of a tradition that places strict emphasis on sober reason and rationality, often to the detriment of what we might call madness, divine inspiration, or mysticism. Others, however, see mystery, the praise of madness, the importance, even necessity of divine inspiration, and indeed mysticism more generally, replete throughout his corpus. One of the most important distinctions drawn in this episode is between transformational experiences and the tomes that follow, which try to enunciate, categorize, and understand various levels and dimensions of transformational experiences. Our hosts insist that this is a crucial distinction to draw and track, and troubles the conventional understanding of Plato as only ever being concerned with the latter, and hardly ever the former. There is, of course, various stops along the way, including the question of ascension and descent in Platonism, the perennial thorn of adequate interpretation, and a timely discussion on the crossroads between philosophy, art, and poetry in the figure of William Blake. Thank you for joining us again. We hope you enjoy.
Okay, so today we're going to be talking about the backgrounds from which Platonism emerges, and all the Platonic revivals, including the Neoplatonic revival of Platonism, as well as the Romantic revival of Platonism, and the cultures and time periods and ethoi, from which they emerge. And to start us off, we're going to begin with a couple of quotes that Greg will read.
Okay, sure. There's a quotation from Mircea Eliade. It's in the chat. I don't know if people who are watching this are able to see the chat, but I uploaded it into the chat. And the first quotation is from Eliade in his book, Myth of the Eternal Return. He says, Plato could be regarded as the outstanding philosopher of primitive mentality, as the thinker who succeeded in giving philosophic currency and validity to the modes of life and behavior of archaic humanity. His effort was to justify this vision of archaic humanity theoretically through the dialectic means which the spirituality of his age made available to him. All positive kudos to Plato there. On the other hand, we've got Peter Kingsley, who doesn't see Plato in quite such a positive light, and his quotation is from In the Dark Places of Wisdom. He says, when Plato and his followers took over these ideas from the Pythagoreans, they cleverly amputated the ambiguities, focused only on the true and the good and the beautiful, and cut out the need for the dissent. We no longer even notice what happened. It's far simpler to keep the divine somewhere up above, at a safe distance. The trouble is that when the divine is removed from the depths, we lose our depth, start viewing the depths with fear, and end up struggling, running from ourselves, trying to lift ourselves up by our bootstraps into the beyond. It's impossible to reach the light at the cost of rejecting darkness. The darkness haunts us. We're chased by our own depths. Very poetic critique of what Plato does with the same material that Eliade says that Plato did a fantastic job with. So those are two ways of understanding Plato and the pre-Socratics. And it kind of invites us to ask ourselves, what were the pre-Socratics up to? What was Plato up to? And what was the relationship? And I brought the quotes, so I'm not going to start with the commentary. Do either one of you want to jump in with a commentary? I thought you had a few ideas, Danny, but maybe.
No, I mean, I absolutely do. I mean, one of the things I like about both quotes is I think that they get at the heart of the tension that still exists when we say the word Plato or Platonism, which is Plato the big bad guy of philosophy? Removed all the mysticism and made everything overtly rational, so that Nietzsche's right that philosophy in the tragic age of the Greeks was the heyday of true philosophy, where we could combine both the Dionysian and the Apollonian, the suffering, but also the joy of dreaming and creating and making things that I think Kingsley sees with the pre-Socratics. So is Plato the bad guy, right? Did he want to deny the descent, want to get rid of the darkness, or, as the other quote represents, was he trying to retrieve this ancient wisdom? Was he suffering from an age that had made these very dichotomies between the uber rational and the uber mystic, and was trying to do the work of rescuing that archaic wisdom that does the work of balancing these two worlds, right? The first book that you quoted from is called The Eternal Recurrence of the Same, right? Which is a Nietzschean / Stoic concept, but it also goes back to Heraclitus, right? In which we're returning always to the same, always in a strangely idiosyncratic way, right? We're going to live, these dichotomies, experience them in unique ways. But at the end of the day, this need to hold these tensions of opposites was something that I believe Plato is trying to do, and that Kingsley just misses the boat, so to speak.
Yeah, he also suggests too that these pre-Socratics were not escapists in the sense of just spiritual. They were very politically involved in their worlds, and that I don't know if it's Kingsley or somebody else who suggests that Plato was also part of this kind of Athenian hegemonic sort of mindset that was trying to sort of dominate the world. But I'm not going to pursue that because I don't understand it. I do think, however, that Kingsley makes a good point in the sense that almost everybody that studies Platonism thinks of it as going up, making an ascent to the forms, getting away from this world. And there's no talk about going down. There's no talk about the descent into, well, it's only alluded to maybe indirectly in the Phaedo with, the initiates into Eleusis, but it's all about ascensional stuff, unless you can correct me on that, Danny. You may.
Yeah, of course. And in the allegory of the cave, the way that it ends is that you get out of the cave and your eyes are blinded. It hurts, suffering. So the ascent itself is dark, right, and blinding. Even when you get out, you have to adjust your eyes, and even when you finally go to look at the sun, like that's also dangerous. You can only look at it indirectly. So again, communicating the suffering, the insatiable, the always reaching. But afterwards, after you get a glimpse, it's the sun, and that the sun is illuminating this world. The philosopher is compelled by this vision of the good to return into the cave, to become that figure that everybody else is going to ridicule for your eyes being ruined, and they're going to say you don't belong here anymore. So you're going to become atopos. You're going to be uncanny, an out of place individual, isolated in some sense when you go back into the cave or the so-called real world. And there is a danger there. Like Plato writes that the person who goes back into the cave, it's not just that they'll be ridiculed, but there's also the threat of death, right? That people inside the cave will murder you for your outlandish ideas about the outside world. And so that there's definitely a sense in which you have to constantly ascend and descend within Plato. I mean, think of the Phaedrus as well. You know, you're cutting your teeth when you're about to ascend, right? You're the wings when they're regrowing. It doesn't feel pleasant. And same with Diotima. Think about Diotima and giving birth to the beautiful. If guys, I know that you've never experienced it, but giving birth is not a light activity. It is pretty dark. It is pretty messy. You get shit on your hands. And so the idea of ascent being clean and beautiful, like, no, it's charged with, you know, all sorts of suffering, all sorts of darkness that ends up being part of the vision of the light of the good. But it also means, because Diotima also says this as well, that you can't just hold on to that one birth, but you have to keep giving birth. You have to keep doing it. So just like with the philosopher descends, you have to keep getting back into the messy.
Well, and I don't mean to make this like a back and forth on just this one issue, but you've made a good, lively response about how there's suffering in the ascent, that it doesn't avoid the kind of going down, you might say. But wouldn't you agree that in large part, when people think of Platonism, they think of getting up to the realm of the forms, and that this is not where we want to be. We want to be somewhere else, the realm of the forms. And that's the part that I think, what I put it, that Kingsley focuses on as a mistake, I think, putting it in a blunt way.
I think it's a necessary mistake. I think it's a mistake that diagnoses how we receive Platonism in a soundbite culture, and whether that soundbite culture is the contemporary age or 19th century, you know, academic, like that I will, you know, be a good academic if I just reproduce this, you know, Plato that is an escapist, because that's what we want to do, right? Like the cultures from which we live, right? They express a desire, and there's a cultural desire that there be some, you know, ivory tower philosophy that's about escaping this world rather than affirming the value of the sensible, of the corporeal, of the body. And if people actually read their Plato or their Iamblichus or any Platonist worth their grain of salt, then they would see that it actually does do that work of retaining the messy, retaining the body, but it's convenient for people who want to look smart and academic, and I have the intellectual chops to repeat that mantra that Plato is desiring us to escape to some other world. The two worlds are necessarily, they belong together. I can go into what I think the doctrine of participation is, but I think that would get us onto a side hustle that maybe is or isn't fruitful. But for now, Gareth, do you have anything to say?
Yeah. What does the art world say? What is the aesthetic
Well,
view
I
of this?
mean, I guess just coming back to the first quotation, I'm sort of interested in thinking about, in the context of what we're considering here, which after all is a tradition that spans over 2 millennia in terms of Plato, and of course beyond into the pre-Socratic and archaic periods. Is in a sense, what Danny was alluding to there is perhaps a sense of a failure of our imagination in some ways to grasp um, the nature of the consciousness, if you like, of this time. Um, and I think the first quote's interesting because, in a sense, it imposes, the Ariade quote imposes a sort of well, a quite modern conception of, you know, knowledge, understanding, and so on, upon Plato, to suggest that he somehow theorizes some forms of either verbal, non-conceptual even, or other kind of embodied practices within a given cultural arrangement and history. And after all, you know, we think about the word theory, we think about theoria, we think about contemplation. And Well, I guess what I'm getting at partly here is, are we, is it a certain kind of misrepresentation in a way, or are we not quite coming at it in the right way if we're making assumptions, or putting upon these ideas um, theoretical constructs and so on that come out of our own conceptions of what constitutes knowledge and what constitutes meaningful types of communication and so on. Because there's a whole, as we know, series of practices and processes and dramas and myths and images and poems which constitute this tradition. Um, so, yeah, I guess my thought is, how do we begin to try to step outside of some of those constraints of our own ways of thinking to really try to understand what's going on in a thinker like Plato? Um, and secondarily, I suppose this leads on to something which fascinates me in a sense, is that, is there such a thing as Platonism, as it were, in the sense of a continuous uh, doctrine or series of ideas, or rather, is it something that's harder to pin down, but which nevertheless seems to hold together some kind of thread, whatever that may be, um, that we recognize in different ways across different periods. And Danny alluded to some of those, for example, the Romantic period in the 19th century, um, Neoplatonic thinkers of the early centuries AD, and so on. So, yeah, two thoughts here, I suppose. One is getting to this wider question of where we see Platonism as a living tradition, if you like, and the other is, how do we get into a different kind of mode of consciousness to approach how we think about what Platonism might be?
You know, I think I'd like to push what's difficult about what Kingsley represents to us, because I think what he's suggesting is that this thread that you talked about has already been untethered from the authentic spiritual transformative experience that's represented in the pre-Socratic shamans like Pythagoras and Empedocles and Parmenides. And that Plato then created a kind of a scholarly tradition of people talking about transformation, but not experiencing transformation. And so how is it that we talk about transformation? And there is a tradition of people talking about transformation. And I think Kingsley is basically trying to suggest that that is a bullshit game, that it's just a head game, that it's not really connected to the power that these pre-Socratic shamanic figures had in their own transformation. And I think in terms of my own research, I've been attracted to Iamblichus, who also criticizes the quote unquote Greeks for being too intellectual and for not realizing that it's in ritual and not in thinking that we're transformed. And so there's a kind of, I'd say, correspondence with what Kingsley's saying about the pre-Socratics as compared to Plato. Maybe that's one reason that I've had a sense of a rapport with Kingsley, is that he sees in Iamblichus a similar kind of critique of the intellectual Greeks that he also feels. And rightly or wrongly, that's just part of the background of where I'm coming from on this. And I'm a Platonist, so I disagree with Kingsley's wanting to just dismiss Plato as a kind of a thief who purloined this great treasure and made it into his own kind of head trip that we're all sort of worshiping Plato for, as if he was some kind of bad guy. I don't buy that, and I've told him that, and I've written that and published that. But I do think that I can see why he says what he says. And people who study Heidegger also have an issue with Plato, and for somewhat similar reasons to Kingsley, although Kingsley wouldn't identify with Heidegger. But so yeah, it's for me, it's not a finished issue. I feel like, yeah, I really like Plato, partly because the guy is so amazingly brilliant and nuanced and humorous, and he's opened me up to a lot of insights and feelings that are legit. But I also understand why Kingsley's criticizing him, because it's easy, even, for people like me who have gotten a lot out of him, to get a little bit inauthentic and a little bit too eager to explain things rather than to experience things. And
So this
that's a sin of the mind, the mental world. That's what we always do. We always want to explain things. I can tell you what it's like to give birth, and I can explain it in detail. And you'll say, bullshit, man. You have no idea until you've done it. And no matter how articulate I could be about describing the travails of giving birth and make all kinds of cool, nuanced comments about it, I don't know it, experientially. And I think that's also what's at stake, at least for Kingsley, on the pre-Socratics.
Well, this is where I would push back in a variety of ways by emphasizing what Gareth said about imposing what we think intellectual, rational knowledge is upon, fifth and fourth century Greeks. Because if you think about this, right, where, we talk about wisdom, we talk about giving birth, we forget that for the Greeks, the fact that Plato was writing, and he was writing in such a way that it was inspiring people. So he's taking this technology that is deadening the culture, right? Writing. So we take writing, which, Heraclitus, dedicated his book on nature to a temple in Artemis, and left it there, and all of the, like, Zeno supposedly wrote things but he didn't want it published. Their writing was a sacred thing, right? Being able to etch certain ideas into the wax tablet and then have somebody read it and be inspired to see philosophy as a purification, to understand that number and form can transform the soul through music. All of these amazing, the words coming out of my mouth are seductive, that they're powerful, they're magic, they're charming, and to take all of these things and to say, look, oh crap, now writing is turned into legalism, politics, sophistry, manipulation, domination, all of these things. And so now I'm going to write. I'm going to, as Gloria Anzaldúa describes the writing process, carve bone into the text that I'm writing, and to show people that these things can be alive, they can be inspiring, they can transform the soul. And so that when Plato's writing, and think about when you go to write, or when you go to give a good inspired lecture, right? Like the magic, the messiness, the difficulty of it, then like you're not really appreciating what intellectualism is. When people talk about like intellectualism as, overly unexperiential, like just as an escape into this realm of the mind, I'm like, what are you talking about? I've never experienced it that way. Like escaping into the realm of the mind. No, it's clawing into the dirt of your mind, picking things out. Theoria, comes from this idea to bear witness, right? To witness your soul in constant transformation is basically what Plato's doing every time he writes, right? Because he never stays in one time period. He's always trying to gather the wisdom of some ancient philosopher, whether it be in the Sophists, where he describes it as the battle of the giants between Parmenides and Heraclitus, and bringing them into tension into this conversation. Like conversations are not, like intellectual conversations aren't mere talking. Like if you say things and talk about things with the breadth of inspiration and enthusiasm that can remind people that talking about ideas is actually healing and not just mental masturbation, then that's an amazing, charming thing. That's magic. And I believe that's archaic.
You're giving life to it. And what you're basically saying, and then I turn it over to Gareth because I've already talked, but what you're saying, words are spells. And in their truest sense, they're spells. But we've also been at certain academic meetings where they're not spells, and we just want to shoot the speaker because it's just horrific. I mean, I'm sorry to be so awful in saying it that way, but when words are spells, but we forget that sometimes. But go ahead, Gareth, you got something.
Yeah, well, that sort of tees me up for a quotation in a way, which is from and I was thinking a lot about something I'd read today actually, and was thinking about a philosopher, a poet called Owen Barfield, who was uh, part of the Inklings group, and he worked with he was friends with C.S. Lewis, and yeah, he wrote very perceptively, I think, on how we understand the past and language and this kind of spell of language. And he says great poetry is the progressive incarnation of life in consciousness. And there's this idea that, in when we think about, you study and you look at how in the medieval period and before that, when we think about, Barfield talks about how thinkers like Aquinas, Dionysius the Areopagite, divine names, the sense of, the Aristotelian sense, the soul is in a manner all things, that we're talking about a kind of communication and a kind of perception of reality which is interpenetrated. It's not the kind of distanced subject object type relationship with which we tend to see the world and each other. It's a world that's alive and interconnected and participated in a very different kind of way. Um, and this, I think, is very important to understand, because then we start to see, the role of myth or drama in the dialogues, the settings of dialogues. All of these factors start to play upon us in a very different kind of manner to the way we're accustomed to engaging with theory, if you like, or with so-called intellectual ideas today. And I wanted to come back to something you mentioned, Greg, because you this point around Kingsley, and in a sense this idea that, if we take that idea on the one hand, you said, we have the pre-Socratics, we have this notion of Plato, the kind of rationalizer, let's say, the documenter, the formalizer, the person that puts into doctrine these unspoken experiential acts. And then you talk about the kind of maybe theurgic practices and Neoplatonic ideas and Iamblichus and so on. And that got me thinking about something else in a way, which is that we tend, I suppose, the general narrative about Plato in some senses, or one of the general narratives in Western philosophy, is that Aristotle is that figure to Plato in a way, and it's Aristotle who somehow conceptualizes or formalizes philosophy, and does away in another act of kind of patricide, his master, as it were, to transform philosophy again. And that's also had, as we know, enormous ramifications in terms of scholasticism and the sciences and so on. But with that idea, and from my area of interest, this idea of Platonism, and the practices that preceding it being some kind of embodied or experiential tradition. What fascinates me is that, the arts have been such an important vehicle for the transmission and continuation of broadly Platonic ideas. And whether it's in the work of poets or artists, painters, sculptors, we find in different ways, across great works of poetry and literature and so on, these sort of recurrent symbolic images and ideas that carry this sort of Platonic seal, if you like. And they, of course, are processes and acts which um, are deeply concerned with this intuitive, creative, incarnational, active, transformative kind of practice. It's the transformation of matter. It's the transcendence of matter, in a sense, into something that points beyond itself, whether that's sound, or whether that's color, or the shape of an object. Um, and and again, I was just reading something on this today, by the Orthodox theologian Sergei Bulgakov, and he wrote that art is the wisdom of the future age, its knowledge, its philosophy. So this somehow this idea that, in that creative act, and whether that's an act of kind of spiritual practice, or whether that's a act of making in the creative artistic sense, it somehow brings out or creates some form of experience which is then conceptualized afterwards, if you like, and which isn't,
Mhm.
it's more
Well,
tacit, it's more embedded.
so the artist, just as a quick commentary and question, I guess here, the artist, whether it's a musician or visual arts, creates something. In the process of their creation, they're not thinking of what it means. They're producing it, they're creating it. And somebody later will then explain, oh, that fits into this theory, or this kind of archetypal sort of explanation in a Jungian sense, a Platonic sense. Oh, okay, that's great. Then it's a valuable piece of work. And it seems to me that's disappointing, because what's valuable is in the act itself and in the experience that we have before the work of art. And sometimes I feel as if our thinking, our habitual thinking, hijacks those acts of creation and wants to own them by saying what it means. And when you think about some of the spiritual traditions, like whether it's the hesychasts in the Greek Orthodox, or
Yeah.
in the Zen tradition, or whatever Buddhist tradition, what they're trying to do is stop the mind from thinking and owning and controlling and explaining, and let it be, because we're so filled with our dialogue about what things mean, and explaining things, that sometimes we miss the beauty that we're offered right before us. So I love what you're saying about the artist as sort of leading the way. And I almost think of what the artist is doing as a kind of a theurgical work, as creating something that comes through them in a sort of divine way. But I'm not so high on explaining what it means, because that seems to sort of diminish the impact of it. And what do I do with that? Do we just say nothing? Here I am, an intellectual, and I've written books and I've used words all the time, but I'm suspicious of my own habit. Is I guess what it boils down to. So
So, if I can jump in,
yeah, do.
there's a few things that I would like to say. Because Plato was an artist, right? Like the writing, I would argue, is a form of theurgic prayer, right? Like, like this having to comport oneself to these ideas, to the ancestors, the people that have inspired him, his relations, his sense of self and soul. That all of this writing is comported to the divine, right? To this uh, this darkness that is still like haunting us, as Kingsley would say, and then writing about it, right? Putting it on paper, writing about the apology, even though it's probably being written with tears in his eyes, and knowing that it's a kind of prayer or thanksgiving to somebody who inspired him, but also to somebody he knows is immortal and is not dead, but living for sure now, within the pages of the apology, and within any spirit that reads the apology with that particular eye. And I say that because the way we read a text or anything, right, view a work of art, is going to mirror back yourself, right? So that if you believe rationality and intellectualism is the only way, you're going to see that in Plato, because Plato wrote with a polyphonic, tone, wrote in such a way that he's a living text that can comport themselves to Greg and to Danny and to Gareth in such a way that we see the wisdom within it that is reflecting our own spirits. And so of course somebody like Vlastos or Kingsley might see, oh, that's the problem, right? Because you don't just see your own soul, you see what you think are all the cultural problems that you're experiencing yourself, right? Because there's also a mirror, right? And so that you're going to see, oh, this is the problem of rationalism, because that's the problem that we're suffering from now. We're overly intellectual, we're overly verbose, we're overly, into talking about ideas rather than living them. And so when people say things like that, my brain goes, oh, you think that's your problem, right? That's going to be what you're going to see. But at the same time, right, when we use words, right, that we're a good teacher, a good explainer, right? When we think of explanation as merely explaining, then we're forgetting, as I said before, the power and magic of the explanation, of the concept of talking about it, to be a kind of initiation, as Socrates says in the Phaedo, into seeing and experiencing these visions. That we have to go back into the cave and use our words and our concepts, because it's part of helping others. And you know what? It's not an easy help. I mean, many times I'm teaching, the theory of forms, and I have to go back down and give the cocktail party version that I don't really appreciate, because it's more nuanced than that. But I do it because I know that that's the easiest way in for that particular 18-year-old kid, or in the case of the Phaedo, for Simmias, to refer to a Pythagorean way of thinking about the immortality of the soul. So anyways.
So in a way that you kind of have to, and I don't mean this to be in a polemic sense, but in a way you kind of have to lie to them in order for them to lead them out of that, distortion of what you really want to do, because you could at least take them a half step towards the direction that you want to take them. But that half step isn't really what, they might want to lock it down with that sort of a cocktail party version of the forms. And that would be disappointing, because that's not what you want them to think the forms are about. You want them to sort of be turned on by this cocktail party version and get opened up and dismantled a little bit by what you're saying. The trick, I think, for what you're saying about explaining, when explaining closes down the explanation, and so they've got the answer, then there's a problem. But when the explanation keeps a window open up, so it starts to circulate in them their own questions and curiosity, then that's great, And you can say to them, yeah, what I told you is not true, but it works, but that's the world that we're in when we're trying to explain things, because it's not ever explainable. All you can do is invite people, and it's not just with the concepts that you use, but it's also within the tone of voice that you use to share those concepts. So words, logoi, is not just logoi, it's phonai, it's sounds. And that's
harmonia.
part, huh?
And harmonia.
And harmonia. Yeah, it's really, it's the whole package. And yeah, I'm sorry. I'm just I
Get
got
back to
spun
what
off
you're
on that.
saying. Sorry, because I interrupted you. But yeah, that's the reason why I think Plato is always coming back to Socratic aporia, right? And the importance of perplexity. And also why, in the Timaeus, we have a kind of bastard reasoning at the heart of our soul, right? This more intuitive, dark, kind of sketch reasoning that we have to recognize is the resource of our soul, that our ignorance and our confusion remind us to transform. This is what I think the golden thread is that every individual who puts forward an idea, an explanation, has to also remember that it's going to transform, that it's got to keep changing, because that change, that reproduction and semblance of the original, as it said in the Phaedo, in the Symposium, is part of what it means to be a Platonist, is to get that vision, that idea, and to know that it's Right, right. I'm not lying when I say a circle is that figure upon which every point on the periphery is equidistant to the center. But it's not that. Those are the words that help me think the idea, as Plato says in the seventh letter. And so keeping that going, knowing that even my most precise moments of knowledge always have a little bit of that ignorance, a little bit of that aporia, a little bit of that need to be like, oh, let's go in another direction. Let's see how the circle could also be a cylinder or whatever it might be. And so
I think that what you're saying is it just makes me feel like Plato was inspired by the pre-Socratics, by Parmenides, by Pythagoras for sure, and likely Empedocles as well. And he wanted to bring about, like Eliade said, this kind of vision in his own style. And what I hear you saying, what I hear Gareth saying, what I'm saying, is to the degree that Plato tries to build in this aporia, this not knowing, this passage into darkness as a way to initiate us into a deeper way of imagining the world, then Plato works, and Kingsley would, I would think, should like that. But he's very resistant to it. But I don't care. I don't care about him personally liking him or not. But I'm thinking about myself in terms of appreciating Plato. To the degree that he incorporates this aporia, that's the Plato that needs to be emphasized. And unfortunately, a lot of academics don't pay attention to that. And they don't pay attention to the initiatory aspect of Plato as a mystagogue. In fact, even to say that Plato's a mystagogue sounds like bullshit to them because they want to rationalize it. And I know that you've written against that. I know Sarah Rapp has written against that in really helpful ways. But yeah, I like Plato who keeps the door open to the darkness. Let's put it that way, which you just articulated quite nicely.
so I want to ask the two of you guys, like, because I think about the importance of Plato writing because of a sense of a crisis of a lost wisdom that there he was compelled, he had to bring these ideas back in some such way to get people to reimagine what Athens is, because Athens has been a bloody, tyrannical, colonizing world that oppresses women and all the very treats slaves as if they can't remember how to double a square. And so it's writing in order to remind people, to give them that mirror of something more than, because I think Plato's living within an age that is forgetful of what the human being really can be when it goes beyond the tyrannical dominating form of being in the world. And so I'm wondering, is there something similar with the figures that you study within the Platonic tradition?
That's kind of an interesting question. It's really, I think that it's true that the social world does tend to shape the things that the philosopher emphasizes in her own work. But Gareth, I've been blabbing away. Maybe something occurs to you first that you'd like to talk about.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, I was thinking a little bit off of the back of the tensions you were raising earlier, Greg, around the non-discursive sensuousness and experiential wonder of the artwork as a process, as a thing, and our experience before it. When inexplicably a tear rolls down your cheek listening to a piece of music or something like this, that emotion and response to something beautiful or sad or whatever it may be, alongside the urge to somehow put that into a discursive form, to articulate it into words, to describe it. And I was thinking about artists, I suppose, who, just thinking about how I see what I do in different ways, who kind of immerse themselves in a way within a world of theory and within a world of ideas and concepts and writing. but somehow kind of absorb that and then transfigure that into this sensuous experience. This then links into Danny's question, I suppose, and that figure for me would be someone like Blake. So I mean, Blake was, I believe, to the extent that he was able to be, immersed in a kind of Platonic tradition. He did read texts that had been translated by Thomas Taylor, and so had access to some Plotinus, to some of the dialogues. And Blake, I think, is a figure we can see as this nonconformist, this figure struggling against his own time, a prophet and a mystic who was only appreciated many years after his death, if you like, and now he's greatly revered, of course. Um, but a kind of messenger for his age, I suppose. And, he perceived a certain kind of transformation, the dark satanic mills and his poem about London of I mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe, this sense of some kind of uh, pain with the age
The
and his
soul is suffering, the
the
suffering of the
suffering.
collective
Yeah, this
soul. Yeah.
suffering, absolutely. This and this also links into the things we were talking about earlier, really, I think, about light and darkness and the higher and the lower. So Blake is a figure you can really see within that set of tensions and images, and in his poetry, of course, very powerfully. Um, but he strikes me as a very interesting figure in that way because he, in one sense, embodies and uh, transforms certain kinds of Platonic symbols into his own quite unique art forms. Um, but on the other is a figure who is very prolific as a poet and a writer and a critic, um, as well as a visual artist as well. Um, so yeah, that would be an interesting example for me of someone who I
Well,
think there's a lot of good evidence to suggest that he really is very much a kind of Platonist of sorts.
and
Um,
at the same time, he's very suspicious of the use of the mind that imprisons us. He's the one
yeah,
who said we have these mind forged manacles, that keep us
indeed, yeah.
imprisoned. And Newton is creating this sort of rationalistic sort of kind of totalitarian prison, you could say, that Blake could see people feeling the weight of and suffering from. This is what you were referring to. You could see on their faces they're suffering. And
Mm.
I think we've been kind of talking around and about that. How do we get in touch with that genius of the human soul that Blake was very attached to and loyal to? And how do we resist the manacles that the mind wants to impose on us? Going back, it's Plato tries to do it with aporia. Iamblichus wants to do it by talking about that it's ritual and not thinking. And I think people have tried to get at this in their different ways, but yeah, I love Blake is a powerful figure, and his art is just compelling, right? His visual art.
Yeah, I mean, if you'll allow me the indulgence of another quotation from Blake, which is exactly what you're talking about here. He says, "If it were not for the poetic or prophetic character, the philosophic and experimental would soon be at the ratio of all things and stand still, unable to do other than repeat the same dull round over again." So there was this sense, that, as you say, within these mind forged manacles,
Yeah.
that um, there was something was being lost of our ability to be in touch with this ancient wisdom.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, you said the word genius, right? Which, is the daimonic, right? And that
Yeah.
Socrates, always, held on to that, right? Like this, I'm gonna listen to that daimonic. And the thing I think, and I'm not sure if Newton would fall under this category, but you mentioned him, so we can use him as a straw man today. Maybe problematize it some other episode. But we think about the difference between a Newton and a Blake, right? Where Newton is the way that the mind, he's using the mind, or at least how we interpret him now, is to control nature, to control oneself. That the mind, when we depend on its reasoning, is an attempt to control ourselves and our way of being in the world, and to manipulate. So this is what I think is the dark magic, if you will, of a culture,
Yes.
right? When
Right.
you're trying to control and make things happen with your words, that has no room for the aporia or for the spontaneous, for the movement of kura, that winnows back and forth and changes and transforms. And so, like the difference between, I think, the genius and the people who make and bend reason so as to manipulate, control, survey. You can survey, you can rationalize, but if it's not for the sake of control, that means your reason can go infinitely different directions, and do a lot of crazy things that are absolutely 100% rational. The myth that Socrates advances in the Phaedrus is rational. It makes sense, but it's an imaginative way of talking about the more than, rather than appealing to attempt to control. This is the only way that you can interpret this myth. This is the rational account. This is the scientific or objective account. And so that for me is the difference. And this is what I think, the crisis is for a lot of these geniuses within the tradition. Is It's a very simple sight, right? Like, why are you trying to control? Why are you making your mind your prison, your body your prison? Let's flip it, turn it around. The mind can be a prison if you so see it that way, but it can also be how you fly. And so,
Yeah, that's beautiful. I think what you initially said was those moments when we penetrate to a kind of a deeper vision of reality, we can see how clearly we're living in a dark world. And it's as if a sorcerer had imposed a dark spell on the world, and the use of rationality to control everything, and kind of in a self-serving kind of way. It seems to have a mind of its own. And in that sense, I can fully understand in mythic language how fundamentalist Christians will say, oh, Satan, that's Satan's power, because it works. It energetically, you can see it, and at least they've got an image for what we can feel. And I think there's some value in having images for that kind of domineering, kind of rational controlling. And we put this on Newton, but that's the sense of it, and it kills the soul. And that's why we're living in such an effing sad world in many, many respects.
Not to go all feminist on you guys, but here's this simple idea that when you remember that truth and wisdom is like a woman, right? It's feminine, right? It flows or moves, right? Like it women, like the spirit of this feminine, that you can see throughout a bunch of different Platonists. You always come back to like a Sophia type figure, a Beatrice, or a muse, that when you try to control the muse, that's when the muse is going to be like, ugh, and it's going to give you back exactly the kind of art or systems or ideas that will enslave you, right? Because that's what you asked for, right? Like a kind of genie. But if you can see her, right, this wisdom in its bridal, hopeful, sensual,
Don't make
unexpected.
her too good, though. Don't make her
Yeah, no,
too
but
good.
she's unexpected, right? Like she's
Yeah,
gonna
right, right.
whisper the sweet nothings that you never would have imagined. And once you let her do that, then that's a different relationship to your
And
wisdom.
she can be a super bitch too, and that's
Can. Oh
valuable
yeah.
too.
I mean,
I mean,
but
that's
Plato doesn't
important.
deny this either. Remember, like think about Dionyma, right? She basically just calls it Socrates a little idiot. So...
She does. But she's pretty nice though, all in all. Yeah. But you make a good point. And our culture has tended to be not, how would I put this? And I don't want to reduce the emphasis on the feminine to just female bodies.
No, no.
It's a whole dynamic, it's a whole kind of receptivity. But I do think in general, female bodies tend to be a little bit more receptive to that than male bodies do. And I don't know, and maybe I'm being reductive or thinking testosterone controls us too much, but there's a difference, I think, between the male psyche and the female psyche. And I don't want to go into all of that sort of,
No,
trans talk, but I think there's a difference. And I think that women are, anytime you go to a dream group or a yoga group or a visionary group, 80% of the people there are women, not men. And they sort of be a little bit more tuned in to these sort of visionary kinds of things.
And this is why, to go back to the pre-Socratics, right? Like, one of the things that's important to notice that I can't quite recall if Kingsley picks up on it either, but all of these, sage-like figures have some sort of connection to the divine feminine, to women, to mothers, who passed the torch, who were, priestesses, and then, up into the Neoplatonic age, we've got your Hypatias and your Asclepiades and these women who were part of this tradition, and they've always been there, right? When you look at the tradition with eyes wide open, you look and see in the Platonic dialogues that he's saying that we have to have co-rulers, remembering that the Republic is both a psychological and a psycho-political text, so that it is a political text once we see it as a psychological text, because once you heal your soul, that's going to change how you're going to do politics. But when you heal your soul, you know that there's an equal rulership of the male and the female, or the masculine and the feminine, the kind of wisdom that is exacting and the kind of wisdom that is intuitive or manic or inspiring or aphoric, and that you need the two of them together so that all bodies contain the masculine and the feminine and are crying to be married and to have equal status as legitimate sources of wisdom. But also, like, as you were saying, like, physically embodied, women have been carrying the torch of this tradition for a long time without credit, not because we need it, but that's part of the beautiful nature of living history, is that somebody like myself can go back and show that the history is very different than we think it is. Like, no, women have been carrying that torch, maybe not in the written texts that have survived, but if you do a little digging, you'll see them, and they'll be winking just like Sophia at you. So.
The most powerful magical act human beings can do is to give birth, and only women can do that. And we just don't even pay attention to that, but I think it is the most powerful magical act human beings are capable of. And we tend not to recognize that women perform that magical act. And it should be probably reverenced and emphasized far more than we have done.
You see, this is one of the reasons why I think Nietzsche was a kind of Platonic mystic, and I will wait for another episode for me to explain that fully, or at least justify it. But in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he says, in women, right? Like women are for pregnancy, right? Like, and when you first read that as a young scholar or a young philosopher, you might interpret it as sexism. Oh, Nietzsche's sexism. He's reducing women to just being vessels and pregnancy. But no, coupled with all the various different things, other things he says about women, he says, in women, the impossible is possible, right? Like that what happens when a woman is pregnant is the gestation of something from nothing, right? Like, yes, there's seed, there's things like this, but like what way it's going to go, that it's going to be a Simon or a Felix or a Sarah or Jasmine, like, we don't know, right? It's complete, but it's going to be, the impossible is going to be born, the unexpected, the spontaneous, and it's going to come through travail and hardship and love, deep love, that even, it's impossible to explain.
Not sentimental, not sentimental.
Yeah, exactly.
It's deeper than sentimental love.
I think about me, like when my first child was born, and they handed them to me, and I was like, "What is this? This is a mole. What do I do with this mole?" Right? Like I was upset at myself that I didn't experience this overwhelming, "Oh, you're the most amazing thing." I thought, mole. This looks like a little mole. But you know what I did? I cared for that little mole every day because I believed in the good, and I believed that this was right and this was something beautiful. It came from me, right? And it came from my sense, like this kind of connection to this thing. And then before I knew it, I knew what deep love was, not because of some sentiment, but because of hope, belief, love that just was motivating the very act of giving birth, so on and so forth. Yeah. And so,
Yeah, and if somebody said, "Well, what did that mean?" I say, "What the fuck do you mean? What does it mean?" I lived it. I did it, yeah. So
and to know that when you give birth, you will never know what that person's going to be like, right? Like that aporia. And that's what part of the love is not wanting to control the child, but let it dance, let it do the thing it needs to do. And so
yeah. So I don't we're gonna I don't want to overtalk any of these things. I just as a point of interest, before Peter Kingsley wrote In the Dark Places of Wisdom, he said that he was incredibly depressed and he went into a little Airbnb somewhere and laid down, and he describes things in a rather dramatic way. This is one of his stories, and he said he had a dream that this big black woman was in great sadness, and she was the soul of the world, and she said, "I want you to tell my story. Nobody's telling my story. You need to tell my story." And so he said that inspired him to write In the Dark Places of Wisdom. However you want to take it, but it was a woman that made him write the book as he describes it.
Greg, you
Yeah.
never responded to how you think Iamblichus was responding to a cultural crisis.
Oh, you know what? I think that Iamblichus came from that line of Syrian priests and kings, and he's, highborn kind of fellow. And I think that it was just in his blood and in his sort of ethnic sort of identity that he understood that we had an access to the gods by going into trance states, because that's what they would do in the temples in Syria there in Apamea. And at the same time, he absorbed the intellectual, doctrines of his day, Pythagoreanism and Platonism, but he remained a Syrian kind of a mystic, and he had enough kind of wealth to, I guess you could say, nurture his education and then create his school in Syria. But it was in the Roman Empire, when things were sort of changing, and the whole notion of a polytheistic world was kind of being shaken up by the collapse into the imperial court and the emperor's importance. And then when the church took over and became the imperial church, that sort of put a kind of a pressure on local religious centers, whether it's in Apamea, Syria, or in Egypt or wherever else. So he was living at a kind of an interesting time of cultural change. And I think he was trying to speak up for what he considered to be the old ways, the old traditional ways that were connected to the earth, to the gods of places, that the gods were connected to certain geographical places. And that's why he was irritated at Porphyry, wanting to say, "Oh, whatever name we call it, it's the same, it's the same thing." He's, "No, it's a very specific place, very specific God." And he was more of a traditional guy, stick to the old ways. I don't think he would have had much of a feel for AI. No, neither do I.
Well, he didn't have to, right? So
No, he did not.
yeah.
So what I actually felt like I learned something here about softening up the the critique Kingsley makes of Plato by remembering that Plato does emphasize the aporia and the darkness and the cave and not knowing, and so that's good. I'm glad that we did this for that.
And remember, guys, I mean, what I love, one of the things about people don't often notice about the Republic is that it's narrated at night by torches, right? like they're like it's an evening, you know, the whole thing. Like you imagine it as a brightly lit, but no, like this is after a festival. They're waiting for, and so even the storytelling when it takes place was in the darkness, right? And I always think the Timaeus was that way too. It's an evening feast in the dark, right? Like it's not electric lit. It's, you know, torches with inside somebody's home. Same with the symposium. Yeah, I know the days are a bit longer in Greece, but still, like it's
Yeah,
still
right,
evening
right.
affairs. And so, yeah.
So are you heading off to Greece soon?
Yeah. In fact, let's go ahead and wrap this up, guys. So yeah, thank you. Any final thoughts before I turn off the recording?
No, I think we've had a good
Gareth?
exchange.
They're great. Yeah.
Well, you guys are amazing. So thank you for doing this. All right. See you guys later. Bye.